Teaching the large class is sort of like being in a huge stadium. So let me use an analogy. If you were to be in a huge stadium and the crowd were to suddenly break into the infamous wave, that's something that is quite noticeable, and there's this general crowd effect that takes over, a crowd mentality, as some people might want to call it. Now put yourself in a small classroom. If people were to do the wave in a small classroom, at the very most it would be a minor annoyance and you wouldn't really notice it that much. Well, it's the same in terms of organization in a large class versus a small class. If there's the least bit of disorganization that occurs in a large class, it becomes amplified really, really quickly. A few students might catch on to it, and then you start to hear murmurs throughout the classroom, and it spreads much like the wave and becomes quite a distraction. In a small classroom, you can often get away with a little bit of disorganization, not in a large classroom. Organization is key.
Now, what do neurons do? I'm going to have a lot to say about neurons, so I'm just going to introduce you to neurons right now. You have an awful lot of them. You got 100 billion neurons. The average person, 100 billion neurons.
Because I prefer lecturing, I'm quite comfortable in a large classroom. There are things that I know other professors like to do in terms of breaking students up into small groups, and from stories I've heard from colleagues, this has been met with varying degrees of success. It's not something that fits my style, so basically there's nothing that I find limiting in a large classroom.
Each of those neurons makes between 1,000 and 10,000 connections with other neurons. That is the communication that takes place throughout your brain at every single point in time, including right now.
In fact, when I find myself in a smaller classroom, I actually go into the same mode that I go into in a large classroom in terms of being hyper-animated, even talking much more loudly than I probably ought to.
Yeah, so some scientists keep brains in jars so that they can study them at a later time. And one brain that's been kept in a jar for study, in fact, this brain has been on tour cross country, literally. It's at Yale, it's been to Berkeley, I think it was an opening act once for the Rolling Stones. It's Einstein's brain, and you know, he was a pretty smart guy. I think most people would agree to that.
Well, I use a lot of technology in teaching, and in terms of trying to get them engaged, what I do is really exaggerate everything that I do. I run around the classroom while I'm lecturing. I emphasize my voice in terms of inflections and in terms of amplitude. And I also tap into the kind of things that students are interested in on their own, a lot of popular culture. And they tell me they really appreciate that in terms of how I use that to exemplify some kind of concept that I'm trying to get across.
There are areas of the brain that are going to become very active to give you the sensation of pain. It is important, as you'll see, to sense pain, otherwise you would do bodily harm. So that's all regulated by brain circuitry. But we also know from studies that people that are taking placebos for pain will actually have a reduction in those brain areas that communicate pain to you. Look, they stopped lighting up in this simulation.
There are certain goals that I have for this course in terms of what I want students to get out of it. And one of these goals is the breadth of psychology as a scientific discipline. Now, by analogy, if one were to open up a restaurant, you could have different types of menus. You could either focus on a few dishes and spend a lot of time preparing each of these dishes, or you could have a larger variety of menu items for people to choose from. I tend to go with a larger variety because it articulates more with my goal of how broad psychology is as a scientific discipline. Now, that also fits in very well with my preference for lecturing rather than getting into discussions on just a few key items, which for me would not work very well in a large classroom setting.
And then finally, people discovered that yes, it looks like some glial cells actually do what neurons do. They are capable of sending electrical messages. In other words, communicating. In other words, higher order brain activity.
Well, I use PowerPoint a lot, but I use it in a way that is different from the way most professors seem to use it. I use it really as a platform for delivering multimedia content. That is in line with my own goals for the course. It's in line with what I think is more effective pedagogically, rather than loading up PowerPoint screens with nothing but bulleted text and then worse yet, reading off of that. So I try to avoid that at all cost.
Well, the more dendritic spines you have, the more communication you can have throughout the brain. Well, the more communication you have throughout the brain, the more complex things are, the greater the thought processes, certainly in terms of humans. So dendritic spines is a situation where more is better than less, unlike some of those genetic abnormalities that I was talking about.
I use podcasting as a way of actually shrinking the class, making it psychologically smaller, by inviting students to come to my office and record discussions about what went on in class that week. In other words, I don't do what most professors seem to be doing with podcasting, and that is simply recording lectures. For me, it's an actual educational enhancement, an extension of what's going on in class, not simply a recording of the class.
So myelin is insulating the axon, but nothing can get through if it's insulating the axon. But what causes neuronal activity? It's things getting through the membrane, as you'll see. But it's not letting it get through the membrane. Who designed a system like that? Well, fortunately, the nodes of Ranvier, the interruptions in the myelin sheath, are bare. There's no myelin there. So what is literally happening in a myelinated axon is what we call saltatory conduction. Saltatory conduction.
Well, occasionally students will invite me to go have coffee or to do an interview because they've been assigned to do that for a journalism class, and I jump at the opportunities to do this. So these are all very high priority items for me, and it gives me a chance to get to know the students as individuals and occasionally talk a little bit about course content. How are things going? What can I do differently? Is there something that I can do to help you as an individual? So I find these very helpful, in addition to the podcasts, which a very important avenue for getting to know students really, really well.